everybody, to the second event in our Writing Cultures seminar series on the theme of para-ability. This week, we're really excited to welcome Dr. John Miers. John is a cartoonist, illustrator, academic and teacher. He's currently a lecturer in our illustration animation department in the School of Design in KSA. John's PhD thesis, entitled Visual Metaphor and Drawn Narrative, developed a synthesis between philosophical understandings of depiction and visual metaphor. John used his recent researcher in the archives residency at the London College of Communication to produce an autobiographical comic book in which he adopted the styles of other artists to express and process aspects of living with multiple sclerosis. This publication is now held in the Wellcome collection and has won awards. John has continued to publish new autobiographical comics, drawing on the archival research conducted during his residency, and has also broadened the scope of his work in comics to explore the contribution graphic medicine can make to disability studies and public health discourse. His talk today is titled, I Preferred It When This Stuff Was All Just Theoretical. I will pass over to John now. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Kate. Actually, and thank you for the introduction. Actually, by introducing the context of some of the stuff I'm going to talk about, you've saved me a bit of time, so I might actually be able to get through all of my slides in 20 minutes, which I've not managed to do in any of the run-throughs that I did this morning. So let me just go to OneDrive and okay. All right, PowerPoint Live is loading my presentation. Okay, that should be it. So hopefully everyone can see that.
Yes, we can see. Great.
Okay, so I'll start by explaining the title of this talk, which Kate's kind of already hinted at. So I preferred it when this stuff was just theoretical. So what that refers to in sort of personal narrative terms is that towards the end of my PhD, pretty much exactly 5 years ago, there was a situation where a bunch of ideas that I'd been working with from kind of a purely theoretical perspective actually became kind of personally and practically relevant in a way that I really just couldn't have predicted. More specifically, actually, I used this exact phrase as the title to the concluding section of a chapter in the edited volume that is the cover of which is currently displayed on screen. The chapter was about psychological approaches to philosophical problems of depiction, and I produced the drawing that you see on the cover of this book as actually kind of part of my argument in the conclusion to that chapter. KSA colleagues might recognise the names of one of the co-editors, Maggie Gray, who's a lecturer in critical and historical studies. So I was delighted, first of all, when Maggie and Ian were willing to use this image as part of the argumentation, because it's it was a traditional text-based chapter, and then a little bit later when they asked me if they could use it on the cover, and of course I was very, very pleased to say yes. So I will loop back to this as my final slide. I'm first going to kind of go back and flesh out the personal narrative. But just to give a little bit of context, so people here who have some familiarity with some branches of the humanities may already have recognized that the image I'm showing here is an allusion to a famous illusion, the duck rabbit. And if you're more inclined towards art history, you may have first thought of this version, which originally appeared in a German humorous periodical in the 19th century and was made famous by its use as the opening example in Ernst Gombrich's classic Art and Illusion. If you're more familiar with philosophy, the version of this image you might have thought of would be this more schematic version that was used by Ludwig Wittgenstein to illustrate his concept of seeing as. My own version of it is rendered in the style of the underground cartoonist Mark Bayer. But as I say, at the end, I will get to why it was done in that way and hopefully try to explain how it actually contributed to presenting a theoretical argument in this chapter. Okay, so now looping back 5 years to give the sort of narrative that I mentioned. So this is an excerpt from Epileptic by David B, which was the topic of the concluding chapter of my PhD. So as Kate's already said, my PhD was about visual metaphor and drawn narratives. And what I was doing there particularly was bringing together sort of theoretical approaches to depiction from art history and sort of smooshing those together with cognitivist approaches to metaphor and trying to develop a more substantial theory of visual metaphor, and in particular how visual metaphor is used in sequential drawings that communicate narratives, i.e. comics. And Epileptic, I'd chosen this basically because, as you can kind of see from this slide, it's a wonderful example of the use of visual metaphor. And the topic of the book is it's a graphic memoir about the trauma that has been visited on David B and his family by his brother's severe epilepsy. But my interest in it when I selected it was kind of purely theoretical. I was like, this is a great example of visual metaphor, so this will work really nicely to kind of sum up and explain how all these ideas I've been chewing through actually operate in practice. And I suppose just on a personal level, I was like, this is one of my favorite books. I'd love to spend 15,000 words writing about it. What I couldn't have predicted at the time that I chose it was that, well, I was drafting this chapter. I did the first draft of this chapter in January and February 2017. On November the 30th, 2016, I received a confirmed diagnosis of multiple sclerosis. So you could imagine those following couple of months, the process of writing about how a cartoonist used his practice to process the trauma caused by chronic neurological disease, while I myself was being quite deeply traumatized by the news that I had a chronic neurological disease. Yeah, that took on this new and very acute kind of personal salience. I didn't mention any of that in the PhD because you can imagine the kind of conniptions my supervisors would have had if I'd proposed making such a change at such a late stage of the project. But it seemed very clear that, right, that my next big project has got to do something with this, and you know, do something like what David B did, use my practice to try and work through some of this stuff. So I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to do that as part of a postdoctoral residency at London College of Communication, which I began in the summer of 2018. In particular, they, in their archives, had recently been bequeathed a collection from the artist, curator, critic and poet Les Coleman, and this collection consists of a vast and varied array of underground comics. The proposal that I made was that I would look through this particular collection and the rest of the comics they have, and I would catalogue instances where cartoonists had constructed visual metaphors to talk about experiences of physical impairment, illness or disease, and that I would then kind of repurpose these to tell my own story. But it quickly became apparent that actually the research plan as originally proposed wasn't going to work in that way. And this was basically because there were not very many examples of cartoonists depicting physical disabilities or illnesses at all. There just wasn't enough material to work with. What I did find, however, was that there were many, many instances of cartoonists using depictions of physical impairments or conditions as metaphors for more abstract psychological conditions or mental health issues. And I was particularly struck by this sequence from the autobiographical comic Schizo by Ivan Brunetti. So what's happening here is Brunetti is depicting a dream sequence, and in this dream sequence he kind of goes to school and he gets, you know, taunted by the people who bullied him when he was at school. Just before these panels he explains to the reader that he gets so nervous around people that he inevitably loses control of his excretory functions. So this was striking to me because, well, the kind of social anxiety that Brunetti describes here, I'm fortunate that that is not something that I suffer from. However, so he's used as a metaphor for his social anxiety a loss of control over his continence. And well, that is a common symptom of multiple sclerosis. And so the kind of thing that he is depicting as a metaphor here is something that literally has been a cause of considerable distress to me in the past 5 years as I've been suffering from this condition. So this felt like an exact inversion of my own experience. I should also say I shouldn't have been surprised by this finding, because this is exactly what metaphor theory predicts. One of the key tenets of conceptual metaphor theory is that when we construct metaphors, what we do is we take the properties or structure of a more concrete concept and we use that concept to kind of conceptualize or structure our understanding of a more abstract concept. So using the physical to understand the mental is exactly in keeping with metaphor theory. So in order to kind of find a way into this, I thought that kind of the best thing to do in a way was to basically invade Brunetti's comic and confront him with this stuff. So I redrew some of these panels and turned up and had kind of a robust discussion with him to try and bring this stuff out. And doing that meant that I had to try to replicate his style. I had to try and draw myself in his style. And this allowed me then to pick up on an idea that I developed in my thesis, which was that drawing style, more broadly, illustration students will have heard us talk about this in terms of visual rhetoric. So I was sort of constructing this idea of visual rhetoric as like a structuring metaphor that guides the way that we encounter any visual narrative text. So when you look at this image, the underground comic style that Brunetti uses, I mean, the forms here, they kind of look like the forms that we might see in material for children. They're kind of simplified, they're kind of bouncy and rounded, but also they look grubbier than they would in children's comics. And of course, children's comics and animations do not contain the kind of language or depict the kind of scatological content that we see here. And so in order to kind of successfully adopt Brunetti's style, I had to not just kind of draw like him, but I had to create a world that had the same kind of content that his comics have, and I had to kind of create a version of myself that might act in the same way that his characters might act. And so I used this approach to tell a story of a particular incident. Well, you looking at these three panels, you can kind of guess what's going to happen next. I was actually on my way to work one morning. It happened to be my first day of work as an hourly paid lecturer at the Royal College of Art. So, I mean, that should have been a day of, some pride, really. I mean, it kind of was a good day in some ways, but it began with what remains one of the most disgusting and humiliating episodes of my life. But kind of redrawing the whole thing in this kind of slapstick underground comics way allowed me to kind of gain some ownership over it, to construct resilience in the face of this trauma, and well, to laugh at my own misfortune. And that was a very productive and empowering thing to do. The other story that I created in that comic, Mark Bayer, who I've already mentioned, I adopted the style of Mark Bayer. This was for a story that was more about the process of diagnosis and some aspects of treatment. And the reason why I thought Mark Bayer's style was productive here was that his he's got kind of an outsider art sensibility. His distorted figures and exaggerated perspectives create a sense of kind of visual dislocation that seemed very appropriate to the sense of psychological and emotional dislocation you go through when you receive a piece of very, very traumatic news like this. So that was the project that kind of basically most of what I've done in the last 5 years has kind of followed on from this in one way or another. So that was obviously an intensely personal project, and most of what I've done since then remains personal, but I guess I've tried to broaden it out a little bit and take in wider debates and perhaps be of broader use than just kind of using my own research as a coping strategy. So this is this is a contribution to a special issue of the journal Biography, published by University of Hawaii Press. Those of you familiar with academic publishing schedules will know that, although actually I just got sent the print proofs for this morning, but the fact that it's just about to be published doesn't, of course, mean that the work was completed any time recently. This was actually done in the summer of 2020. And this is still drawing on the primary research that I did during the residency. So here you see my two kind of established autobiographical selves, and I'm in conversation with the more kind of naturalistically drawn character is John Hicklenton, who was a British cartoonist, and the more schematically drawn character is Lindsay Cooper, who was a celebrated composer and musician, both of whom are now deceased, and both of whom suffered from multiple sclerosis. And so what's happening in this sequence is that my sort of two schizophrenic selves are having a fairly robust conversation with them about approaches to disease management and ways of conceptualizing chronic disease. And something that is acknowledged here is that for both of these people, I mean, you know, multiple sclerosis research proceeds apace, and there are treatments that I have had that were simply not available to them during their lifetimes. Another forthcoming publication, this one is just back from the printers. This was produced for an Amsterdam-based organisation, Arias, Platform for Research Through the Arts and Sciences. The publication is called Hinterlands, and it was about sort of transdisciplinarity. It was about different ways of knowing. So again, you can see from the commentary here that this is very much still rooted in my personal experience. But what I was trying to get at here was kind of difference between, you know, more objective and subjective ways of knowing, and in particular, objective measures of disease and subjective experiences of disease. So the visual structure of this is that the background to each page is a fairly detailed watercolor of an MRI scan. An MRI scan, as explained here, is an important tool for diagnosis in MS and in a whole host of other diseases. And while it gives very, you know, it can show you precisely where there is damage to your nervous system, but that precision cannot explain the phenomenal experience that you have as a patient. So, you know, there's no way that a radiologist can go, right, you see that bit of damage on your spinal column, that explains why you had that weird twinge in your leg all of last month. It just doesn't work like that. So that's kind of what I'm getting at here. And the overall rhetorical strategy, visual rhetorical strategy, was that I overlaid on top of these watercolors kind of simpler and more obviously cartoony drawings where I talk more directly about personal aspects of experience. So on the left-hand side, there's me looking at a deliberately kind of poorly drawn hand. So obviously I've mentioned a few times that, you know, a key practice and research interest for me is the small details of drawing style and how they affect the way that we approach visually created narrative worlds. And so something that I find both terrifying and morbidly fascinating is the prospect of the way in which MS is going to reduce my ability to draw in the way that I want. I mean, sadly, I've got more. I spoke about this on the previous slide. I've got more damage on the left side of my brain, which means that I have more